catch most legendary Pokemon, but after completing to get them first, as well as the ability to rebattle gym leaders and the Elite Four in extremely challenging encounters, where they have perfect team compositions and AI dialed up to very difficult. Actually, that's another great of improvement in these games. The original Gen 4 Pokemon games were fairly challenging. Like, they would never get mistaken for a Dark Souls, but they did push back on the player a little, and some fights, such as Cynthia, were legendarily relentless if you went unprepared. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl actually retain that aspect. Enemy AI, team compositions, and move pools are some of the best the series has seen, and fights can end up being fairly challenging as a result. Now, these buffs to the enemies are almost necessary because the game retains the controversial EXP share from Sword and Shield. Which will give every Pokemon in your party experience points after you finish a battle, regardless of whether or not they actually participated. There is, frustratingly enough, no way to turn it off either. Now, to the game's credit, the EXP share here feels better balanced than it has been in other games, but it can still be really easy to get really over-leveled and trivialize a lot of the encounters in the game, which is almost a shame, because as I mentioned, some of them really are well designed. It's easy enough to circumvent the EXP share gains. You can keep a rotating team of more than 6 Pokemon at a time and keep swapping them in and out to basically have a bigger roster you're working from. And to be fair, I'm enjoying using a lot of Pokemon I've never before because of this. But again, I would much rather have made that choice for myself rather than being forced into it because the game was handing out so much experience points that the only way to maintain challenge for a lot of it was to resort to workarounds like these. Now, Game Freak already had the perfect solution to this problem through Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, which let you turn off EXP share if you didn't want it, but left it on by default. Why not just offer players that option again? Even with a lot of the encounters in the game being trivialized, however, the late games ones hit hard. Elite Four and Champion battles in particular being extremely challenging, and the post-game battles being the best NPC battles this series has seen. It's just really a shame that so much of the good work that must have surely gone into designing these encounters has been unnecessarily compromised by insistence on not offering player options. And there are some other problems. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are actually the buggiest Pokemon releases that we've had in a while. There isn't anything game-breakingly bad, but you'll often see random stuff like textures not loading or getting stuck in the geometry, a consequence of adding full analog movement to a grid-based map without properly accounting for it, I guess. Sound randomly cutting out, or even just outright crashes. The good news is the game has a really aggressive autosave, so you never really lose a lot of progress when this does. It's just a shame it happens at all. A day one patch has already made things better, but there's still a long way to go, and hopefully ILCA and Game Freak continue patching the game, because while Pokemon games have never been paragons of good programming, they at least don't let their messy coding get in the way of the player's experience too much. Right now, that's decided the case, and while none of these glitches and bugs are too frustrating, that doesn't really absolve their existence to begin with.
Hear the music.
There are 3 other points that I want to discuss. One extremely positive, one bafflingly negative, and one mixed. So let's start with the negative one, because to be fair, it's also the most minor one. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl have frustratingly patchy touchscreen support, which is almost hilarious because the original games pioneered touch input for Pokemon to begin with, but that's where we are. Touch input is for the Poketech smartwatch, and in some random and arbitrary areas, as such as for polishing up your own gym badges, or minigames such as digging out treasure in the Grand Underground. But it's not supported for input in battles or menus. And that's almost the whole game. This isn't a major problem, but it's baffling. Why is touchscreen support consistent and patchy? For example, I mentioned above that minigames like digging for treasure in the underground support touch input, but Poffin cooking, on the other hand, does not. Why? Why not at least be consistent within the limited scope of touch input implementation you decide on? It's just so unnecessarily confusing. Again, none of this is a major issue just because input is at best a convenience and you get used to its absence in 3 seconds. It's just a curious and amusing point of interest. Far more positive, and this one is substantially more important, are my impressions of the soundtrack. Patched in with a massive 8 GB day one update, the soundtrack for Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are the best, most atmospheric set of the tunes this series has had expertly. Almost every remix is a slam dunk. I'm sure there will be some changes that some don't like variously. I myself am disappointed with the least 2 songs as remix, but on the whole, the music here is a resounding triumph. Plus, much like and Soul Silver, the beloved remakes of the equally beloved Gold and Silver, these games unlock the ability to play the original soundtrack later in the game as well, for those who simply prefer the sound of the DS games over the remixes. As positive as I am on the soundtrack, I'm on how the game looks. Now, to be clear, I don't think it necessarily looks bad. It definitely looks better than it did pre-launch, and I'm a fan of the chibi style aesthetic for Pokemon, particularly when well done. In Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, it can't help create a real sense of place for Sinnoh, as well as, particularly when paired with some gorgeous and extremely detailed battle backgrounds, which always include Mount Coronet towering in the background. But at the same time, I'm not sure I'm the biggest fan of how this game has done the chibi thing. I think something like the Pokemon Let's Go look would have been the way to go for these games. By retaining super deformed character models that are decidedly not to scale, these games end up looking weird a lot of the time, particularly when the camera makes the misguided, confident decision to zoom in on its characters for close-ups.
Hey guys, Ron here, and here it is. I have played Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, and now I have opinions. But since this game is a remake, I kinda have to talk about them in a different angle. Sinnoh is not one of my favorite regions, but far from my least favorite. I have my problems with Diamond and tiny bit with Platinum, like the over-reliance on HMs and weird progression, and these games addressed some of them, but unfortunately BDSP didn't fix some of the flaws and even added a couple of their own. Because of how faithful these games are to the original, a large percentage of my experience was virtually the same. And I'm not going to be talking about these elements because I'm not reviewing Diamond and Pearl. I feel like I'm harping too much on the negatives and changes because aspects of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, like Sinnoh's route design, exploration, post-game, and atmosphere all stem from the originals. While half of the video will be dedicated to the cons of BDSP, they only represent a small fraction of my feelings toward these games. I'm actually going to start with the negatives, then move on to stuff and general gameplay, and end up at the positive aspects. And since the cons come first, I'll start with... I want to begin by talking about the number one aspect of the game that contributed to my experience while playing, and that was the faithfulness of these games. Of course, I knew that these games were marketed as faithful remakes, and I was always in the mindset that BDSP weren't going to include much or any Platinum content, but it seems like fans don't have a set definition, or at the very least, a consensus as to what faithful remakes even mean. The answer is, it's relative. Every person has a different perspective based on content. So that means I was comparing the faithfulness of BDSP to other Pokemon remakes. Considering we already knew about additions to the game prior to release, like the Grand Underground, Following Pokemon, and EXP Share, I suspected these games would have quality of life updates, but still be more faithful than Fast and Let's Go, since faithfulness was repeatedly marketed. These were always going to be Diamond and Pearl remakes, not Platinum remakes, and while you could be fine or angry about it, that was the mindset I had before playing. But as I played, at least to me, these felt less Diamond and Pearl remakes and more like Diamond and Pearl Switch remasters. I have nothing against style. Technically, ORAS is chibi, and I was totally on board with the art style, but none of that excuses how Overworld is. Even the cutscenes look like HD remasters of the original. Considering the Gen 4 Overworld is already 3D, BDSP's world is just an enhanced version of it. There is barely any additional setting or details that make use of the fact that these games have been remade. Not just when it comes but the design, story, and progression. Apart from the Underground, there was no attempt to elevate the source material, and worse, they didn't attempt to fix a lot of the flaws that Diamond and Pearl had. You see, when people clamored for Platinum remakes, it wasn't just because it added stuff like the Battle Frontier or Distortion World to make a difference to me in the long run, but rather it was because Platinum was a third necessary the original had, like the weird level scaling, awkward gym progression, bland overworld textures, and incomplete Pokemon availability. Like how a lot of the cool new evolutions are only accessible in the post-game. These were all glaring flaws that Diamond and Pearl had, and they're all present in these remakes. These games would still be faithful to the essence of Sinnoh, even if their Platinum fixes were still included. When I'm playing Brilliant Diamond, there is no general feeling of, oh, I can't wait to get to this next place, I wonder how they translated it, because the answer is, they did it the same way. Not once did I say, oh, that's what that detail was supposed to be, it's more fleshed out now, because nothing was made deeper. Compare that to ORAS, where each interior has unique world-building details that weren't in the original. Even the very faithful routes had details that the originals didn't have, like Wingles flying around and craters in Route 114 and 15, which all helped make the environment feel more real. But they were still faithful. Nobody says Mr. Briny's house is less. It has wooden beams, more furniture, and a ceiling light. Even Let's Go, which had a very faithful overworld, had tons of details that are faithful to the original, but still elevate the source material. In BDSP, there are super select few places that have these sorts of minor changes, like the petals in Floroma Meadow, lighting in Eterna Forest just like in Platinum, and the snow and frost on the buildings in Snowpoint. These are all faithful to the spirit of the originals. They simply because of the hardware limitations. These minor updates would be present throughout a majority of the game, but there is no good reason that they weren't. I'll talk about the graphics in general and what I did enjoy later in the review, but right now I'm talking about the general art style and philosophy of this game's appearance, and how there was no real time or effort put into making it look special. Ultimately, my experience wasn't that of playing a new highly anticipated Pokemon game, but rather replaying Diamond and Pearl on the big screen, which was far from my experience of ORAS or Let's Go. At the end of the day, I had fun because they are literally Diamond and Pearl, and I had fun playing those games in the first place. But the one major addition that they did decide to include wasn't the most positive of changes in my experience. The EXP share in its current form was added in X and Y, and in Sun and Moon it was reworked so like in Black and White the experience on the Pokemon's level, so it's more balanced. This helped eliminate grinding, and those who wanted a tougher playthrough could easily just
this game, and Brady with one last kneel down. Oh, he slipped there. All right, everybody his head or something. And now we go to halftime. That's going to leave a mark. That's the goat. That's the Zika back there. You don't mess with.
So,
When do you spray Febreze Air?
after
Starting from Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, the EXP share became permanent, but Game Freak made those games with that in mind. Let's Go explicitly encouraged the constant catching of Pokemon and easy EXP gaining through Pokemon catching, so it was obvious they wanted you to have a team of more than 6 in order to not become super overleveled, in combination with the fact that the levels and teams of the gym leaders were more balanced than in Yellow. The permanent EXP share returned in Sword and Shield, but the progression of these games were highly considered, especially now that you have 3 options with the wild area available. The point is that these games were balanced around the EXP share, but tacking on a permanent EXP share on a game that wasn't made for it without any changes to the existing level curve of the gym leaders and trainers was a bad move in my opinion, especially in a region with so much to explore and many optional locations that you should be able to visit during the main game without worrying that your team will become overleveled. It was around the 3rd gym when I noticed this problem. My team was already overleveled for Maylene, and I knew that Crasher Wake's team was the same level as despite the decent amount of content there was between them. This was fixed in Platinum, but in BDSP I had to assemble another 6 Pokemon and make various strategies in order to not become overleveled, like using my second team when exploring optional locations. By the 8th gym, I had a team of 12 Pokemon, all at the same level as Volkner's average Pokemon, and I never once grinded. I only battled trainers. I imagined that my team would be above Volkner's if I played the same way I did the original games, with a normal sized team. What's weird is that some of you didn't have this experience, and I don't know how. I suspect a lot of people just avoided a good amount of trainers or didn't notice that they were slightly overleveled at times. The fact is, I had to actively try to prevent this game from becoming way easier than it was in Gen 4, especially with Affection. Now that friendship is tied to Affection, 6 or 7, where your Pokemon would dodge hits and land crits only if you actively play with them in a Me and Refresh or Pokemon Camp in Gen 8. But now with the falling mechanic and general EXP share, your Pokemon easily gain Affection, which makes battling gym leaders easy. I had to constantly give my Pokemon herbs to negate this.